McKenzie. I'm one of the senior response consultants, and that's Mark Graham. And we're going to talk to you about an intelligent approach to cyber strategy. So, cyber's sexy. Everyone knows cyber's sexy. Cyber's always been sexy. For those of you old enough as me and Mark, you remember when it was properly sexy, when it was more than about a foreign country penetrating your network, but it's still sexy. Cyber is the sexy part of security, and threat intelligence is a really sexy part of cyber. I think my favourite quote on it, and I've got a favourite quote about threat intelligence, which I know makes me incredibly sad, was at RSA 2014, a guy called, I wish I could remember his name every time. He'll come back to me in a minute. He was speaking about threat intelligence and referred to it as like teenagers talking about sex. They all think they're doing it. They all think their friends are doing it. Everyone thinks everyone else is doing it. The few that are doing it aren't doing it particularly well. And that's very like threat intelligence in the community. Everyone loves threat intelligence. They all think it's really sexy. They all want to do it. They all want to get onto the latest, greatest thing. They're buying anything they can get hold of. It's not really well thought out necessarily. And it's a truism. Sex sells. You can package up anything, put it together, and then people will buy it. One Direction, cultural relevance, significance of songs, really bad, but they sell loads and it's really popular, but it's not necessarily very good. And that's the thing about threat intelligence. You really need to think about what you're getting. So what is good threat intelligence? It's about getting ahead of the attackers. AV gives you something. AV gives you an ability to stop the basic stuff. The AV in your anti-malware protection is good. I think Symantec were being slightly disingenuous this week when they said about AV being dead. I think they mean the market's completely saturated and they can't sell much more of it. But I don't think it's gone. But threat intelligence isn't about that. It's about the most sophisticated threats. It's the stuff that you don't know about, and that's what good threat intelligence is. It's about educating you about the stuff you don't know about. But that's not to say it should be stuff you've never heard of. It's got to be stuff that gives you informed knowledge. It enhances the knowledge you already have. It shouldn't be some real esoteric thing that's never going to affect your network. It's got to build up your protections. It's about outlining the exploit du jour. It's about understanding what's going on. It's about understanding the capabilities, the motivations of attackers, why they'd be interested in your network, about why a nation state would be interested. It's got to give you information on your sector before attacks happen. That's really where it needs to be. It's got to give you that richer, wider picture of the threat landscape and how it changes. I mean, we've all seen over the last 10, 15 years how attacks have changed. We've gone from the attacks that used to focus on ports and protocols, looking for weakly secured ports, but now they're looking at, it went on to more about looking at different ways of compromising your infrastructure. They moved on to attacking databases, then on to spear phishing, and now we mostly see strategic web compromises. The attackers morph. They don't get rid of their attacks, they add new ones to their armory, and they'll come back and revisit old ones when they need to attack you again. But it also should provide some information to your senior management cadre. This is where threat intelligence is really important. It's about getting threat intelligence into your business and making it onto the risk register. How can you protect your organisation if you don't know what the threat is? How can the board apply the right resources to it if they don't understand it? So threat intelligence educates the board, and that's where good threat intelligence feeds those three things. But it's got to be timely. It's very poor if you find out about a strategic web compromise a year later. You know, not many people have got logs that are going to cover that. You really need something quite soon. It's got to be relevant. You can get lots of information on defence companies, but that's no good if you're a finance company. It's really got to be applicable to your organisation, and it's got to be relevant and actionable. If it's not something you can use, if you're not mature enough in your approach that you're taking some threat intelligence that's full of feeds and has tons of IOCs, that's great if you've got a mature posture and a security architecture that can take IOCs, but if you haven't, then it's useless. TI has got to, sorry, I keep getting up. TI should form the basis of everything. You know, it's got to be the basic and get it onto your risk register. By explaining to everyone what the risks are and having the TI across the board, it will explain to you. But every vendor tells you their appliance is full of intelligence, it's full of data. They promise you that their appliance has got magic flux capacitors, that every time a packet traverses the network, a puff of magic threat intelligence is created, and that will get reported to someone. or it's already packed with the latest threat intel and it's bringing it down more and more all the time. But I think what they're talking about there is they're just talking about big data. And big data isn't intelligence. It really doesn't give you anything. Data has to be sifted through. It needs to be assessed. It needs to be looked at. Taking tons and tons of data doesn't tell you anything. You need to get through that data, process it, and from that you'll begin to get towards information. Information's good, but it doesn't help you make strategic decisions, and that's where you need to get to. You need to be able to make strategic decisions about data on your network. So we still need to go through another level. We need to assess that information, we need to look at it, we need to process it, and that will begin to get us towards intelligence. And that's where we need to be with all this data. So everything else is just noise. It's pointless. It's not pointless, but it forms the opinion. But it's an iterative process. The information that you've got to through looking at your data to get information, you're going to have to go back to the information again and go back to the data. You need to ask more questions of the data to enrich your knowledge. Only once you've got to that point, you begin to get knowledge once you're able to insert it into your appliances and do something with it. It's kind of like mining and extraction. You can't just pull the dirt out of the ground and expect to find gold. You have to sift it, you have to process it, you have to look for it, and then there'll be some nuggets. But not everything you pull out is going to be useful, so you need to be quite proactive in your testing. So applying this to network security, you start off with this huge amorphous blob of data that you look through and you begin to process and find out that some of that data relates to traffic between IPs that shouldn't be talking to each other, maybe RDP sessions between a part of the network and another part of the network that you don't expect to see. You begin to process that, you look through your threat intel and you find out actually ultimately that's going to an IP range that's been alerted to from threat intel from Mark that you should be blocking. That gives you, that's the useful part of threat intel. That's where it's useful. This reading of lots of data that doesn't give you anything informs the knowledge, but it's good, but it's got to be at that point. But as I said, you've got to work through that process. You've really got to that point of going through the data, information, intelligence to get into knowledge. So what do you protect? What are your crown jewels? I think organisations are now beginning to understand that you're going to get breached at some point. There is going to be a compromise. You can't stop that. But you've got to work on an idea of protecting some of the data over other bits of the data. Not everything is completely precious to you. Some things, I think, are more precious than others. But how do you identify what's important on your network? Most of us here work in IT. We work in security ops. We're not the people who know what's important on the network. There's got to be someone who, in the board or in the operations, the COO, can inform the security team of what's important and allow us to put the right resources around the data at the right time. But also, there's an idea of short-term secret. Not all data needs to be protected for all the time. If you do mergers and acquisition activity, you've got a massive short-term secret where for a couple of weeks, maybe a couple of days, a couple of months, something's really precious to you. You have to protect it. If you lose it during that time, it will cost you a lot of money, it will cost the client a lot of money, and it will lose a lot of reputation. But then 2-3 days later, it's in the press. So how do you get that right balance between all those bits? So you really want to be melding the threat intelligence with business intelligence. People in security ops shouldn't be trying to do the business intelligence, but the business intelligence should be telling us where we need to apply our resources, and that's fundamentally important. CPNI, the Centre for Protection of National Infrastructure, adopted a couple of years ago the SANS critical controls, which I think is a very sensible approach, and it's a very good approach for everyone. They allow us to create metrics of how organisations are protected. Look at the controls, and that's across the whole network. The controls look at protecting from the most damaging attacks. They give you consistency of controls, automated defences where possible, defence in depth. They recognise that not many people are actually going to be able to implement the control fully. If you do, happy days, that's probably going to protect you nearly against every single attack. Say, application whitelisting. If you put that in, there's not much that's going to get onto your network, but they recognise a lot of these things are very hard to do. So there's defence in depth, and each control adds another layer. They focus on root cause problems that must be fixed, but they also allow you to create metrics, and the metrics are really important. So we combine it with a capability maturity model, which means that maturity in this sense isn't how grown up you are, but it's about the move from an ad hoc process to a formalised process, so that you know that the way you're protecting your network is properly done. And the reason that's really important for us is because that allows us to go back to the board and say, actually, we're protecting the data properly. We can show them a roadmap of where we're going to and how we're going to get there, and the controls we're applying at the moment. Combine the threat intelligence with that, we can see the attacks du jour and the methodology change of the attackers and ensure that we're putting the correct controls in the right places at the right time. And it stops the business investing in sexy technologies that don't provide any benefit, and that's the important thing. So how do we win the battle? We all know that network defense is a game of cat and mouse. We're the defenders, and the attackers are always the attackers. But they're also going to be probing for holes in our defences. They're going to look for ways to compromise the things that we haven't got. So threat intelligence is fundamentally important to this strategy of defending. It tells us how the attackers are going to try and attack us. We need to stay one step ahead of the attackers. That's very hard to do as defenders when we don't know what's coming down the pipeline, how they're going to change their attacks, how they're going to change their tools, how they're going to change their methodology. But we're not alone in this game. That's the nice thing, that by taking threat intelligence and taking the correct threat intelligence, you can see compromises that have already been detected from other people. It allows you to build a force multiplier of knowledge. Sophisticated attackers aren't just going to attack you. No matter how important you think your business is, they're going to attack everyone in your industry. So by being able to collaborate and understand, you begin to build that sector knowledge. But no one wants to share, no one wants to say, I've been compromised, or I might have been compromised. That's very hard to do. But by doing it through anonymized research, which people like Magpie can do, it begins to help you understand more about that threat and where you're going to. But the attackers are industrial. They're not going to stop. They're going to keep going, they're going to keep trying. It's counterintuitive to share, I know. It really is. But you need to think of ways to do it, because being able to call out a nation state and say, we know you've got a sophisticated attack against our network, it doesn't work very well when it's a lone organisation. But if you can point to a campaign that's ongoing across a whole sector, that's politically embarrassing. And that's really good. And that's one of the reasons for sharing and for investigating. People don't want to share because they don't want to say to the attackers, we're stopping you. They think by not telling the attackers will go away. They won't. They absolutely won't. They'll carry on going. But what it will do is it will stop them. They'll have to change their attack tools. They'll have to change their infrastructure. It will cost them time and resources. Politically embarrassment as well, that's really strong. It's going to stop them. Monitoring. Monitoring allows us to see what the attackers are doing, but it's a really tough call for an organisation to allow us to do that and to let the attack run. But if you let the attack run, you can find out more about where it is. If you choose to delete the attack, you see the attack on the network, and you face that difficult decision, what do I do? Do I delete all traces of the attack and hope that's got rid of the attackers? Well, might do. Yes, it's one way of going, but you might want to investigate and see where it's going, understand that breadth, the depth, see what else they've had access to, understand what their motivations are. If you begin to understand that, you might be able to stop future attacks. It also stops that point of, in 3 months' time, when another security researcher finds on a compromised server somewhere else some of your client information that's come from your network, you getting hauled in front of your board or your client and saying, well, what else have we lost? Being able to do the investigation tells you that. But it is a fine line of being able to balance when and where to pull the plug. But even if you stop them, attackers are going to keep trying. They're not going to go away. So the attackers ultimately are going to have been tasked by someone. They'll have been planning to get onto the network. It won't have been, it's very unlikely any sophisticated attack got onto any network via a whim of an attacker. There would have been planning and decisions made. Someone would have been tasked to understand the network, understand how they could compromise you. They would have then been given tasking to a group to attack the network and get on. Once they got on, there'd have been planning and understanding of how to analyse the data that's on the network and what to take. And then that'll be processed and they'll ask more questions of the data. Rob Sloan, who this presentation's white paper's down there, the presentation's based on, highlights this in the intelligence lifecycle. But the attackers aren't going to go away, because if they lose access to the network, all they're going to say is, hey, you over there, I need access back to that network over there, please, can you go and get it? It's not, then kick them off once, they'll keep trying, but every time we kick them off and we do more damage to them and we highlight to them, we make our case stronger. So I guess the question is it worth it? Well, we've seen that it's a key component of your strategy. By using it, we're able to articulate what the attackers want to do, how we protect. So yes, it is there. The value of it, well, it's the value of the data on your network. If you lose the data on your network, what will it cost you? So the Pomon Institute this year put down the cost of a sophisticated breach at $3 million US So that's just over £2 million, and that's a huge amount. In 2012, Jonathan Evans at Security Services just down the road said they'd had knowledge of a FTSE 100 company that had lost £800 million from a hostile cyber attack. Greg Staphenhole, who was the CEO of Target, last week stepped down. He didn't step down just because of the huge breach and losing 110 million cardholders' data, but it certainly contributed to it. They said that that breach cost them $100 million in new infrastructure post the attack, $61 million from the cost of the attack itself, so $161 million. That's a huge amount of money. And this is the problem, or this is the challenge for us, that boards are beginning to ask, are we doing enough to protect our data? And we have to give them an honest answer. We have to say whether we are or we aren't. Mark is now going to walk you through a case study that highlights our threat intelligence.
So I'm going to highlight a case study, Operation Argon, anonymized here, but a real live client who we provide a full-time monitoring service for. But really I want to step through and show where we've applied threat intelligence to assist in an active investigation, go through how we spotted the origin of the attack and how it evolved over time, what we learned from that, the conversion of a large amount of data and information into intelligence, and then how we fed back into the intelligence cycle, and that developed our requirements and the client's requirements as well. In the same way as the intelligence cycle is used for the attackers in order to find out what their requirements are and how they may achieve their goals, we can use that for a defensive purpose as well. So on this, in this particular compromise, it's probably an attacker that you're all quite familiar with. So yeah, we essentially monitored the network and saw an intrusion in the start of 2012. That was the beginning of the Seraphim intrusion, later known widely as APT1. At that point, it was essentially an unknown threat. Our SOC analysts were monitoring activity, watching out for infrastructure, domains used, a lot of malware, attacker tools, and that was really great for building up an idea about what are the capabilities of this actor, what indeed are they after on this client's network. We didn't at the time have much of an idea about where it was coming from other than China. Mandiant have attributed it to the 3rd Department, 2nd Bureau, People's Liberation Army, which is widely accepted to be accurate. Now, by the time Mandiant released their paper, the attackers had already shown signs of leaving the network, and by the time I think the paper was out there, pretty much all activity under that breach had stopped. So it kind of shows, I guess, a collective effort is rewarding here. We had a lot of data, Mandiant had a lot of data from their perspective, other organizations had seen different things, because everyone's got their own unique intelligence. They've got different clients, they operate in different geographic areas, and they've got different levels of capability as well. So I've spared you from most of the things with IPs and domains, but well-known APT1 domain blog.arrowservice.net was used in this compromise. It was a command and control domain. After the actors seemingly had stopped operating on this network, we continued to track their infrastructure, and we noticed that they'd parked their domains towards Google IPs quite often. So that was a little idiosyncrasy of this group, but we noticed they moved one of the particular domains to an IP that wasn't Google, and so we thought, activity stopped, why aren't they parking their domains? This looks like it could still be infrastructure, perhaps active on another client, on another victim, or just laying in wait for some kind of resumption of their mission. That led to additional infrastructure. We mapped out and continued to kind of watch activity. Obviously now a lot of other people were coming forward and releasing their information that related to the same actor. So aggregating data from open source and other researchers just added to the picture we had from this actor. So that's kind of the history of it. Because we had watched the additional infrastructure, which was not used in the compromise, but we wondered why the actor may have moved their domains to that particular IP, we had obviously proactively signatured that. And so that was already deployed across all of our monitoring solutions, and lo and behold, we got a hit on it. So I think that was early 2014. There was activity from that orb. operational relay box, an attempt to access this client network. Now, 3 attempts were made, 2 of which failed, and the 3rd succeeded. They were using credentials that we had known had been taken during the previous compromise. 2 of the members of the organisation had left, so their credentials weren't valid. The 3rd one, however, was still employed there, and that let the attackers in. So at that point, they are back on the network, but we've got a good idea about who it is, but more importantly, we've been alerted to that intrusion at that point. So it kind of shows as well, a public release of information didn't necessarily scare off the attacker. We did notice slight changes in how they operated, but to totally change how you operate, it's very costly. So I think a small change, a few techniques to try and hide their traffic or the move of infrastructure. They obviously thought the risk was low enough to resume operations. But at that point, we didn't know for sure that it was the same actors. And this was very much what the client wanted to know. Is it the previously observed threat actor back again? Because the risk level may have increased. If it's someone else, maybe we don't know, we don't understand how they work, we don't understand necessarily what their goals are, we don't understand how they may move through the network or what tools they may use. If it's the same actor, we're pretty comfortable that we've got that covered, but we still need to learn how they've changed. In terms of the actual data in use, we obviously had a lot of TTP, so we've got the tactics, techniques and procedures, a way of categorizing how an actor operates. We've got active infrastructure monitoring, as I mentioned before, so we are tracking the actor moving their infrastructure, even if it doesn't relate to a particular compromise. We've got passive DNS from open source and other researchers, TTPs relating to this group. And specific to this investigation, we also had a lot of firewall logs and VPN logs from the client, and we performed some active collection against the attacker infrastructure, as well as fusing all of that data with our host agent telemetry from across the enterprise. So at that point, we obviously have to take all that data and turn it into intelligence. So that was a process of infrastructure mapping, a lot of log analysis to rule out any legitimate sort of remote access from various areas of the world that might be from staff that were traveling. But also look for patterns, see what emerges, see what looks a little bit suspicious. Fusion of the host agent data as well was great, because it means that if we saw a network event, we could also see what was causing that on the host, and so we got visibility from both angles. And obviously analysis of any recovered tools and reverse engineering of malware. This essentially leads to the product, which is threat intelligence. We can issue a report, detailed report, confirming that this is indeed the same actor, Seraphim, and we kind of proved as well that their goals were still in line with their previous mission. So we had detected that first intrusion. However, it wasn't the first intrusion. We did notice that there was activity related through the mapping of accounts that had been compromised. We actually saw that there were other intrusions earlier from different infrastructure. So that had been at the start, the very end of 2013. So even though we had proactively deployed signatures and we thought we'd caught it the first instance, we hadn't quite got there. But when you look at the lag time there of 3 months, given that the initial detection when contacts were involved with this client in 2012, the intrusion was 2 years old on their network by that point. So actually, being able to proactively signature what may be related by conducting this additional investigation did indeed buy us a lot of time. So the client-specific sort of intel as well, which is another reason why it's good to kind of keep a in-depth record of your own intrusions and the incidents you deal with. The 3 accounts that had been used were known to have been used previously as favorite accounts by the attacker in the initial compromise. So that kind of lent a lot of weight that either the task had been handed over to another group, or it was the same actors back again. So as the client was pretty satisfied that the risk wasn't any higher than it had been previously, we understood the attackers, we understood their motivations, they actually let this intrusion run. And that provided a very, very rich amount of data. So we continuously saw visits from a particular IP address that we'd identified, one that wasn't made public by management, and to my knowledge hasn't been associated with with this group until now. But we saw outgoing SSH attempts from the network to that IP. Now this was something that wasn't a previously known tactic used by Seraphim, and perhaps shows that they try to improve their operational security by using a method of encrypted communications. Luckily, in this case, though, the client network blocked outgoing SSH connections by their policy. So we saw the actor quickly resort to their tried and tested methods using their plain text communications to not only push data out, but also to bring additional tools down. Onward research into that infrastructure actually then revealed a whole host of juicy intel. So we scanned their attacker infrastructure. We saw the kind of versions of SSH they were running, not something you would commonly sort of necessarily see on a Windows box, but also an outdated version of a free SSH daemon here. Something else that we could use to then kind of confirm any suspected infrastructure if it had the same banner for that. It was a high likelihood that it was the same actor was in possession of that infrastructure. But perhaps what is the most interesting was we collected samples from an open FTP server on there for 8 days until, unfortunately, open source reporting from another company did kind of draw too much attention and scare the actor off that piece of infrastructure. We didn't lose track of them though, because we had so much visibility and we'd done our own mapping and found additional infrastructure. However, that one went cold. But before that happened, we managed to pull off a lot of files, including encrypted data that we managed to recover, which really give us a huge insight into this beyond the scope of just this intrusion. So we saw that we're still using commonly associated APT1 malware, mini ESP and Eclipse rat, with very little change. We saw that they had actively compromised a health sector website. We're serving payloads from there, but also using it as a C2 node to lend some legitimacy to the communications. We saw that they had a new binary packer, so a way of making the executable harder to detect and smaller, unique to this group, and I don't believe anyone else actually has that in open source at the moment, something that we can provide to our threat intelligence clients. And essentially it's a good way of essentially signaturing malware, but also being able to identify it's a particular group who's using it. We obtained passwords as well that they used to encrypt their phishing payloads when they were at rest on the server, showing that it was probably a multi-party effort where this was a kind of a cache of tools and of data, and individuals would pull down what they needed when they were setting up a new phishing campaign or C2 infrastructure. And we also, from the payloads that we recovered, could tell that they were targeting not only this particular client and their sector, but health, government, telecoms, extraction, manufacturing, and R&D, based on the nature of the phishing documents. Something that was very much in line with the previous observed indicators for Seraphim as well was that they were deploying malware via a self-extracting archive. They hadn't come back with zero-day exploits. They hadn't obviously invested a lot of time or money in bolstering that kind of initial deployment or exploitation phase. So the fact that their infrastructure had been, and their implants had been burned by Mandiant in the March, didn't really trigger a huge change and did allow us to quite effectively track them just a few months afterwards. So essentially, to recap, threat intelligence, it has to be timely. In this instance, we didn't get the first activity, but we were very close to the resumption of their duties. But it has to be ongoing as well. You may deploy some threat intelligence that might not catch it before it happens, but it may catch it very close to the start, or at least you can use it to reflect on a previous incident and understand what the impact to your business was. It has to be relevant, which essentially boils down to who is targeting you. What are the major risks to your organization? You have to understand your data, you have to understand which groups want which type of data and what their capability is. Often you can pool the mitigation efforts as well, but there's such a wide variety out there, and you may need to segregate data of a particular sensitive nature because you know a threat actor who's interested in that has a much higher capability than, say, your average Chinese group. And actionable. In this instance, very actionable. I mean, the IOCs we could easily deploy to the appliances we had in place. The reporting was something that all strands of this organisation really did want to read, and they have used it to influence their own cyber strategy. That's not necessarily the case for all organisations, but I think that's essentially where we're driving people towards, and Rob's white paper kind of talks about building that cyber strategy to raise awareness at all levels, because after all, it's a business risk. It's not a problem solely for the IT department. And just to wrap up, threat intelligence, it's been a bit of a buzzword, I think. As Stuart said before, sometimes it's simply IOCs, sometimes it's very expensive reports. For us, we have a fused deliverable. So IOCs that are constantly updated, you can deploy those across your network and your hosts, essentially work with all the major kind of vendors. But we don't stop there. We want to tie that in with a threat actor, to the industry that might expect to see these, so that there's some kind of relevance to it as well. And in the threat reports, they range from regular sort of alerting, which is a more high-level kind of emerging threat notification, where you may have seen something in the press, but what we'll deliver is a little bit more in the background of that, and tie that in with the IOCs that will be deployed. And then some deep technical reporting on the malware itself, which really is what kind of helps upskill your SOC staff. If you wanted to sort of have in-house kind of reverse engineering skills, for example, this is a great way to kind of bolster that information or as a learning experience. And threat landscape pieces are really great for the kind of overview of what are the trends. We've seen move from phishing to sort of strategic web compromise at a more of a board level view, and threat briefings as well. At the end of the day, you can read whatever you want, you can deploy whatever you want, but getting some face-to-face time that either is about something topical or something specific to your organisation, presented by experts in the field, we feel that that is really sort of the way that the marketplace needs to move.